Jason Dorland is an Olympian, father, partner, coach, entrepreneur and storyteller who dedicates his life to pursuing excellence in himself and those he supports. Jason represented Canada in the men's 8 event at the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul. He's also studied advertising design at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. Jason is the author of 3 books: Chariots and Horses, Life Lessons from an Olympic Rower; Pulling Together, A Coach's Journey to Uncover the Mindset of True Potential; and one of my favourite books I've read this year, Ike, The Dog Who Saved a Human. When Jason is not running or swimming with his dogs Oakley and Bella on the trails near his beautiful home on Vancouver Island, he shares experiences and life lessons through coaching, keynotes and workshops with his wife, business partner and fellow Olympian, Robin Ma. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'll give you full marks for saying Robin's last name properly. So, wow, normally it gets butchered into Meager and Mahar and all these sorts of things, but it's a Gaelic name and you did it perfectly. So thank you.
Well, we're off to a good start.
Yes, right.
So let's start. Go back to when you were a young fella. What was life like growing up in Canada?
You know, I've been teased many times that I sort of had Ozzie and Harriet for mom and dad. I didn't realize that I'd won the jackpot with my parents until I sort of got older and had some friends. And, you know, I had a pretty dream childhood. My dad was a lifer at Ridley College in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is, you know, an independent school. He was a housemaster. We lived on campus. I grew up on the campus. I went to the school. And my problems were, you know, not being able to get into the pool one day during the summer, or the tennis courts were full, or, you know, it was a pretty nice childhood. Big problems. Huh? Yeah. And, you know, after the war, Dad had gone to McGill University here in Canada, and he was quite an athlete. And although an academic as well and teacher, you know, he got 4 jocks for kids, and we were all involved in sport and rowing especially. My granddad rowed, my dad rowed, all my brothers, sister rowed, and then I was the babe. And when my turn came, I fell into it, loved it, and sort of off we went. So sport was a huge part of my life. Yeah, I consider myself very fortunate for my childhood.
We're doing this via a Zoom link. You're a big lad. Can you give me height? What are you?
6'4" and a bit, 200 pounds. Yeah. So I think at the time in '88, it was a decent size. I think you go to the World Championships now, I look like a coxie. So, yeah, it was, I had a pretty good frame, and so it just kind of worked.
So you obviously took to rowing well because you qualified in the 8 for Seoul. And before we talk about Seoul and what happened in that event, can you tell me about the lead up? So as an athlete, I was good, not great, won multiple state championships, but never quite went to that next level. So my dream, my aspiration, like you, was to go to the Olympics. When you found out you were going to the Olympics, just tell us about the euphoria, the joy.
You know, interestingly enough, I didn't feel euphoria or joy in the moment of finding out. When I felt my most excitement, and there'll be some men in the audience, I think, who will relate to this, especially of my generation or our generation. I think my parents were at a dinner, and so I drove over to pick them up after the dinner, and they're walking out and they're coming towards me in the car, and they knew that, you know, the final selection was happening that afternoon. They hadn't heard, and so, you know, they quietly asked how'd it go. And I said, I'm going to the Olympics, and I'm going to get choked up. And my dad, you know, very traditional guy, wartime guy. I could count the number of times on my hand when he was excited about my achievements as a young athlete, right? Very reserved. Humility was a big ticket item for this guy. And I'd never seen him so excited. And that was it. That was my permission to be excited. So it was pretty cool. That was sort of, holy crap, I have achieved one of the things a lot of young boys want to achieve, which is impressing their father. And in that moment, I had impressed my dad. So it was good.
It is beautiful seeing your visceral response. You're having a glass of water now. Your eyes are a little bit glazy. You still feel that, don't you?
Oh God, yeah. Oh, it's so alive in me, and I can just feel my chest tightening. I mean, Dad's been gone a number of years now, but as a young boy, I mean, that stuff gets hardwired, right? Our young experiences, and as a young athlete, wanting to garner his approval was a big pastime of mine.
And reading about you in preparation for this interview, Jason, as well, when you set your heart on a goal like going to the Olympics, so much of your role identity it's inextricably linked with that self-identity. So you were and you are an Olympian. You will always be an Olympian. No one will ever take that away from you. I say this to a lot of the young male and female athletes I work with. I want every athlete I work with, Jason, in fact, every high performer in performing arts, entertainment, whatever field that I'm working in, have your main job, but I want them doing something outside as well. So it's just not I'm the athlete, I'm the singer, I'm the artist, I'm the reporter, because invariably that will change or that can get taken away from you. And it's having that stable base around you so you're not just the rower. So seeing how much emotion that brought to you, and then we fast forward to Seoul. You're in the Olympics. You say yourself in a TED Talk, which I loved watching, called The Thrill is in the Chase. And you talk about the arrogance of my 24-year-old self being obsessed with winning. You earn a spot on the team. 4 months later, you and your team cross the line in last position, or I think in rowing they call it DFL. Dead
Correct.
Fucking last, for anyone who doesn't understand rowing terms.
Right.
Next day, across all broadsheets in Canada, Canadians bomb out in Seoul. Do you want to pick that up for me?
Yeah, that was a moment. And, I can still feel that because I wouldn't have known it at the time, but in reflection, I would have considered that my first panic attack. And I had got home from Seoul. My clock was a mess. My parents didn't know what to say, so they didn't say anything. And it was late. Before they went to bed, my dad said, there's a bunch of newspaper clippings on the living room couch. If you want to have a look, we're going to go back to bed. And so I went in there by myself, and I was flipping through the papers, and then I came across to the front page of the Globe and Mail, our national newspaper. And the front page of the sports section was us bent over our oars with that headline and an article that completely laid blame. And 24, 25, and a very young 24, 25. It was the first time my name had ever been in the paper, let alone being accused of screwing up on such a large level. And part of it was because the Canadians had won in Los Angeles, right? So they had won 4 years earlier. We were defending Olympic champions. We had the same coach, same crew members. We were faster, and we blew up in the final. And so, yeah, that was... I remember in the days after, I remember when I read that, it felt like just this rush of adrenaline coming up my body. And I think what hit home in the weeks that followed was, wow, we didn't just lose for each other and for ourselves. We lost for the nation. And I remember it getting so bad that when I would go out to get groceries or what have you, run errands, I had it in my mind that everywhere I went, people were looking at me and pointing fingers. And I was just that paranoid and that messed up. And I really didn't know how to manage it. And so my strategy at the time was to hide. And so I chose Australia, right? And I jumped on a plane and I came down and took a job at Melbourne Grammar and coaching. And that was my escape.
Good place to choose. Come to Australia. we got all heavy. I really appreciate you being so open. As a 24 or 25-year-old, we just don't have those mental models. And I'm assuming back then you either didn't or you didn't have a lot of contact with sports psychology. You would have had your head rowing coach, S&C. So it's all about power and speed and big, strapping young men and women, fast in the boat, dry land training, and no work around those mental skills. That's a huge, huge baptism in failure, in reauthoring who you are. And interesting you say that you felt like the whole world was watching you. The reality, 2 weeks later, they would have been on to NFL or something else. But for you, at that age, that carried on for, what, years?
Years. Yeah, years. I mean, we call it athlete transition now, but everything now in hindsight was textbook.
Mm.
So anxiety, depression, eating disorder, OCD, workout, weight loss, you name it, loss of identity, started to replace rowing with other things to try and chase validation. There were years of bumpy going. And, I'm grateful for it now, but at the time it was a rough ride for sure.
Other things like going out, partying, and being young?
No, it just wasn't my thing. And part of it being, I remember then after we lost, we were back in the village we stayed in these apartments, all eight of us, and our coach were in that. And there was no debrief. We didn't talk about the race. There was nothing. Just the scotch came out and people got hammered. I wasn't a drinker at the time. Yeah, it was just, and as things got deeper and darker, what made it worse was that I thought I was the first one to ever experience what I was experiencing. And so there's no way on earth I was telling anybody, hey, is there something wrong with me? Because this is really hard. And so I just sort of hung on and kept moving forward. But after my year in in Australia, I figured the best way to fix it was to go again, right? And so came home and started training for Barcelona. And that photograph from the Globe and Mail lived beside my bed. And every morning, every night, every practice I went out to, I would look at that photograph and I would listen to the Germans celebrating. And I would just say to myself, there's no way in hell this is happening again. And it was like rocket fuel for about 6 to 8 months. And then all of the anger that I was utilizing to come back, the redemption, the revenge, just came boiling over. And I'll never forget it. I was heading down to the lake to train. And I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost got hit by a car going across the road. So I get to the boathouse. I'm putting my boat down in the water and the oars. And I thought to myself, if I had just been nicked by that car, I could take a few days off. And I just said, Jace, man, that's like, what are you talking about? And I chased that thought away. A few minutes later, it came back and I just rolled back onto the dock and I laid there for about 15 minutes. And that was it. I got up, put my boat away, put the oars away. And that was the last time I rowed. And I just said, I'm done.
There is so much I'd like to unpick on that. I'll pick one or two of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
A chip on the shoulder, we say in psychology, will get you going. Drive keeps you going. So listening to the German anthem, reading that paper and the shame around that was rocket fuel, as you said.
Yeah.
But it wasn't intrinsic. It was all
Not
external. It was everyone else's view on you, how you were perceived, what others would say. So we talk about that internal versus external locus of control. So
right.
I'm surprised you even went 6 months. And then it must have just felt a real blend of, oh my God, just letting go, as well as sadness when you were lying on that dock that you knew that was it, but also just that relief.
Yeah. Well, that evening I was in BC on Vancouver Island training, and I went back and I phoned my coach who was in Ontario. So it would have been just after dinner. And I just told him, I said, I don't think I can keep doing this. And he just said, you've had enough? And I said, I think so, Neil. He said, well, if that's how you feel, then I think it's time for you to let it go. And I hung up and I sat down on my bed and I cried so hard that I shook. And it was just this release of the shame from soul that I had just stuffed away, and all of the anger. And oh my goodness, I have never cried like that in my life. And I woke up the next morning thinking, I don't have to train and, whatever, but I wake up the next morning and and I put on my shoes and I went for a 90-minute run because I felt like going for a run. And I just went and got lost in the trails. And it was the most euphoric experience of just being out there lost in the woods and doing it on my terms.
And for anyone who has retired, in sport, especially when you give a large part of your life to it, when you no longer run, swim, row, tackle, compete, throw, and you look at your diary moving forward, there is so much space and you're a little bit overwhelmed because you've had structure. For you would have been doing 20 to 30 hours a week, depending on the time of year, plus recovery. So it really is a full-time job. And then when you have that freedom, it can be a little bit like, oh, what do I do? Where do I go with this? You just had that up and down, up and down. I can only imagine how great you are with young athletes. Do you teach young men and women in Canada now about athlete transition?
Not right now, but I got back into coaching, years later. And, I certainly can see it now, but getting my teeth kicked in on the world stage is what made me a successful coach. And when I say successful, yes, we won a crap ton of races, but we did it without trying to win. We did it by me inviting them to discover the notion of love when they competed, love for themselves, love for each other, and love for rowing. And none of that was part of my makeup as a young athlete. And so, yes, we were trying to win national championships and international regattas, but we acknowledged that and we set it aside. And we just said, look, we'll go to every day and every day we try to get a little bit better. And then on race day, I just want you to go out and find your best race on the day. But it took what happened in Seoul and then meeting Robin for me to become a different coach than I was an athlete. So very grateful for that.
In your TEDx talk, you say, losing an Olympic gold medal is a first world problem. I wasn't just chasing an Olympic gold medal. I was chasing what I thought it might bring me, self-worth. But you also then went on to say it was such a gift. And I can see that. There's some real parallels between both of us. I have unfinished business on the track. I think I make a good coach, because I don't want any athlete I work with or any performer I work with, Jason, to leave that potential there hanging. And you mentioned the word love. If you went back, a young Jason, 24, 25 years of age, what would you tell yourself leading into Seoul? How would you approach it differently?
First of all, I would have given myself a hug and just said that you're good enough now. Without even racing, you're good enough. Like that you have nothing to prove. And that the medal that you've been so hell-bent on for all these years is not going to bring you what you think it will. And now, goodness gracious, Michael Phelps is the poster child of that, right? If 18 Olympic gold medals doesn't fill the hole, then are you telling me 19 would have, right? And I just think we understand it now. But at the time in 1988, it was, everything was about the win, and it was such an unhealthy culture. So. But like I said, even if I had had the presence of mind, or even if by some bizarre chance somebody had come up to me and shared that message with me, I likely would have told them to get lost, because I would have seen that as weak and trying to undermine my motivation.
Now, you have very good self-awareness. You have very good emotional intelligence. Growing up with your father being such a role model, but being tough, and our generation, for a lot of men, our dads were that post-World War II era. So their dads were in that era. A lot of them went to war. And you didn't show your emotion. It was a weakness. What do you mean you've got feelings or you're crying? Bloody harden up, son. So that would have rubbed off on you as well. So you had that as role modeling. And then you put into the boat in this hyper-competitive environment. So there was really no awareness of emotions and feelings. And when you had them, that's why you totally fishtailed.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I agree. I could count on, as a younger man, 2 times I saw my dad get, sort of blazy-eyed, and I remember being struck, like, oh my, my dad just got choked up, and that was a big moment. Now with Matea, I think she just rolls her eyes. I get choked up so easily, and so yeah, just a different time, right? Just a different time.
What chokes you up? What sort of movies? Because my kids just roll their eyes and go, oh, Dad, like if I watch a good bio, especially a comeback story, I lose it. I one time cried. I was going through a relationship breakdown, so I was a little bit fragile at that stage, but I cried in the Flintstones movie when Fred got sacked by Mr. Slate. No, sorry, when Barney got sacked by Mr. Slate, but it was actually Fred who was doing all the dirty work. That's when I realised I needed to get in touch with my feelings a little bit more because it was being expressed through the Flintstones movie. So what movies do you cry in, or what songs get you the most?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, you talk about bios. Terry Fox, who was a Canadian icon legend. He was the first young man to try and run across the country on one leg, raise money for cancer awareness. And I was a young teenager when he started that Marathon of Hope, ran a marathon every day on one leg. And so now when I see a Terry Fox commercial, I'm done. And it doesn't take much. So, yeah, Terry was, I think for a lot of Canadians, because he died during, he had to stop because the cancer had come back. And I remember when he announced to the nation that he was having to pull out. That was the first time I saw my dad cry. We were watching the news, and I turned around to say, wow, I can't believe he's, and I look at my dad and there's tears just pouring down his cheeks. So that he was a big influence on a lot of young men. Yeah.
What drew emotion for me and really brought feelings out is your book, Ike, the Dog Who Saved a Human. And I'll read the back page. It follows the transformative journey of author Jason Dorland, a Canadian national team rower left bitter, ashamed and lost after his crew finished last in their final at the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, Korea. Dorland retires from rowing and, as a way to cope, adopts a golden retriever puppy named Ike, who was destined to be a guide dog for the blind.
Yeah. Ike makes me cry. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Writing that thing was just nonstop tears and laughter. It really, the process of writing Ike was a gift as well, because I got to go back and relive my time with him.
Can I be honest, when we met and you had this book about a dog, told us a narrative or a story, I was a little bit skeptical. Do you get that much? And I want to be totally frank with you, because he's this big 6'4" former Canadian Olympian. And he's told me he's written this story through the eyes of a dog, and I thought, okay, interesting. Yeah,
and your response. What I find, Andrew, is when I ask people about Ike, I find, it's like anything, a movie or a show or a book, we bring ourselves to the story, right? And so the story is going to interact with us. And so to hear that it evoked emotion and had the effect that it did, there are a couple of men that I've spoken to post reading Ike, and they'll say, yeah, a little slow here and there. It was okay. And what I find in those moments is that, to me, and I don't want to assume that I know what's going on in everybody, but my guess is that there were parts of the book that were uncomfortable. And so they consider that part of the book slow. And whereas women, in so many ways, Ike embraces the traditional feminine of our nature, right? The nurturing, the caring, the loving, the compassion. It is sort of what we like to consider traditionally, I suppose, innate or intuitive for the feminine in us and in women. And so when women give me feedback, rarely, one person has said the book has, slowed down in parts, but most women, it really lands for it. And I think because it gets into some prickly topics about love and compassion, and it's told through the eyes of a pup, which I think for a lot of people packs a punch as well, right?
That's the bit that I love, when I moved beyond thinking this guy's a bit crazy telling a story about a dog, through the dog's eyes. But when I got into it, I loved it. I really did. For a number of those men that have come back and said it was a bit slow, I didn't quite get it. There is a word. It's called projection. So they're projecting their emotions, their feelings, and just maybe uncomfortable or haven't had the opportunity to peel back that layer. And we know this, right? For a lot of people, when you do heal, when you do process, when you do make meaning, there's a bit of sadness, a bit of pain, a bit of negative emotion. And we tend to shy away from that if we've bought into the, click your heels and go to Kansas, Dorothy. Be happy all the time. What I've learnt as I've ticked over a big birthday, I want life to be rich and full and loads of experiences, but I also want to have meaning and connection and love and learn from those lessons. So it's not always about being up. It is actually being comfortable with your emotions and that beautiful range we need in all parts of our life. I want to pull out a quote I loved in the book. You said this is the dedication to Ike. Dedicated to the most unselfishly loving soul that I've ever known. Thank you, Ike, for teaching me how to cherish each day and live life to its fullest, how not to get too worked up about the small stuff, and ultimately, how to more fully love others and me.
I don't know what else to say. I mean, it's true, right? That's I think at the end of the day, he showed me that I was worthy of love. And it took a dog, it took a freaking dog for me to figure that out. And fair enough, if that's what it took. But it was quite a journey with him, and forever grateful, right? So,
how long after Seoul did you get Ike? Because you, just putting the chronology together, you had the Olympics, you came out to Australia at Geelong Grammar, 1990, training again, almost got hit by the car, lying down, you went for the 90-minute trail run and just felt that euphoric bliss in flow, as Mikhailchik and Mihai would say. How long after that did Ike appear?
Yeah, so 92, I moved to Vancouver in 92, back from the island, and then got Ike in 93. And the other kick in the teeth that year was that, of course, the 92 Canadian men won. And so that was another gut punch, right? It was like, wow, if you had hung on, you asshole, you would have got what you wanted, and you were too weak to be able to do that. And so there was some tough days and weeks that followed that final. And, because a lot of the guys from Seoul were in that crew who had stuck on.
That was my next obvious question. Out of the 8, how many were in?
Right. 2, 3, I guess, something like that. So, that was, are you kidding me? Yeah. So, and then Ike showed up, and for the first time in my life, I had to care about someone else more than me. And the focus was off me and onto this beautiful ball of fur with, I love puppy breath. Some people don't, but, and I just was captured in this, what I determined to be, a race at the time, or a competition at the time. I sort of took Ike and replaced Seoul and Barcelona with a little dog, right? He was going to be a guide dog. So I figured, well, screw it, I'm going to make him the best guide dog ever. And so I trained that little guy like nobody's business, and tried not to get emotionally involved initially, but goodness, good luck with that. 4-6 months into it, we were tight, and away we went.
Did you choose Ike, or did Ike choose you?
Yeah, there's, and that's in the book for sure. But even though it's sort of, people joke about it, or it's cliche or whatever, there is no question in my mind that boy came forward and chose me. Even when I think back to the moment of sitting down on the newspaper with all of these pups, and just getting attacked, but the one dog, the one puppy who stayed while they all returned to the center, it was Ike. And I can still remember picking him up and just sort of deciding, well, this is it then. And what a trip.
And when did you meet Robin? How old were you?
Yeah, so 94, summer of 94. Commonwealth Games were in Victoria. Blind date. I came over with Ike. And,
So
initially
you took Ike on your first date with Robin.
Oh my goodness! Of course I did.
Well, it's a magnet, right? You've got a dog like that.
As inappropriate as it may be considered now, he was full on chick magnet, and I was making no bones about it. And because Robin was another Chase, right? If she was this beautiful redhead and highly acclaimed runner, and wow, if I could win her. So for me, it began as I got to get this woman as a girlfriend. And so I'm bringing this dog.
And Robin is an Olympian as well. She's represented Canada.
She's a 17 years on the Canadian national team, middle distance runner.
What sort of genetics do your kids have?
Yeah, well, that's the bizarre thing, Andrew, is that Matea, although a beautiful runner, is a performer. She loves music. She loves singing and being in plays. And hey, if that's her gig, fair enough. So.
Well, it's still performing.
You bet.
I've done a dive into the research. In fact, correctly, Dr. Tom Buckley has, who heads up our research institute, and it's deep. I've got multiple papers here right now, Jason, about pet ownership and quality of life, a systematic review of the literature. I've got Do Dogs Make You Happy? The Power of Support from Companion Animals for People Living with Mental Health Problems. The list goes on and on and on. So let me do a little summary, and then you can add anything to this. Around stress and anxiety, interacting with animals has been shown to decrease levels of cortisol, a stress-related hormone, and lower blood pressure. Dogs are very present. If someone is struggling with something, they know how to sit there and be loving, says Dr. Anne Berger, a physician and researcher at the NIH Clinical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. I totally butchered that pronunciation, I'm sure. Dogs' attention is focused on the person all the time. Around ADHD, a 2015 study found children with ADHD who read to animals had improvements in sharing, cooperation, volunteering, and behavioural problems compared to children who had ADHD that weren't getting the treatment or the time with animals. Around physical health, the American Heart Association points to studies that found pet owners who walk their dogs get up to 30 minutes more exercise a day than dog walkers. I think 30 minutes is low compared to my experience around dogs.
I would agree.
At a 2020 CNN health interview with Professor Harold Herzog, you can't make this stuff up, Professor Harold Herzog at Western Carolina University showed that pet owners have fewer heart attacks, they are less lonely, they have better blood pressure, they have better psychological well-being, they have lower rates of depression and stress, they have fewer doctor visits, they have increased self-esteem, they sleep better, and they have more physical activity and daily movement. I'll just give you one more as well. Around depression, studies have shown repeatedly that people's positive mood increases and their bad mood decreases around pets.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, none of that surprises me.
You didn't need that, though. You had Ike.
Yeah, I had Ike. And, and unbeknownst to me, he was medicine, right? In a non-traditional way, but he was helping me heal. And I think part of that healing was that, one of the things that I think dogs do for us is why we like having dogs in our lives is because they are easy to love. And what I mean by that is we feel safe to love them. There's no worry of, will the love be returned? Will my heart be broken? Will I be compromised or betrayed or what have you? And I think the act of loving feels amazing. I know, Robin and I have talked about this when we lost our Ike replacement, if you will. Katie was a yellow lab cross who lived 16 years. And when she died, I remember saying to Robin, I think what I miss about her was the feeling of loving. And as much as we like to think that with our partners and with our children, and, there are no conditions, but there are conditions. There's always conditions, whether we're conscious or not. There are conditions in our human relationships. But with pets, there's none, right? When I would lay down beside Katie or when I lay down beside Oakley and Bella, the love comes pouring out of me because I'm never worried for a moment is this a good time? Or, are they going to reciprocate? because they will always reciprocate, and it's always a good time. And loving feels good. So yes, they can unconditionally love us, but I think they allow us to unconditionally love them. And, one of the things that I find interesting about humans in terms of how we describe the love of dogs, we put that unconditional word on it. But as I said at a talk a couple of weeks ago, I think if dogs could come to the conversation, they wouldn't describe it as unconditional love. They would just describe it as love, because that's the only love they know. There are no conditions in the world of love and canines.
Yeah, and for people listening to this who have had a pet that's passed away, oh, my heart sinks. I think of Cougar, a Rhodesian Ridgeback that my brother and I shared for 11 years. This gorgeous dog. And I've had friends even say recently that was the best dog they've ever known. I had a mate say that we caught up at Bondi a couple of weeks ago. He said, your dog, he said, I've never met anyone like Cougar. They become part of your life so
For
much.
Sure.
Two other bits to add. Dr. Tom Buckley had told me this morning, actually, in our staff meeting to set up the week, that at Royal North Shore Hospital, where he works, the intensive care unit has a dog come in once a week, and they've had overwhelming feedback from staff and nurses and doctors that has become the highlight of their week, that they're now going to try and bring the dog in double, if not triple the amount of time. So this is doctors and nurses who've grown up in this scientific world now going, where's the puppy? Wanting to come in.
Yeah.
And I told you at the very start I'd share a personal story, and I've got permission from my partner, Toni, to share this. But we had 2 miscarriages, and just for a bit of context, I've got 2 beautiful elder kids from a first marriage. And then when I met Toni, she didn't have kids. And then Toni said, I really want to have kids. And was told from a young age that she would probably need to go on IVF to do that. So we went on IVF and we had 2 miscarriages, and the second one was over a 4-month period. And it's a terrible time. And I'm telling this story with Toni's permission, because there are so many women especially who feel when they do have a miscarriage that they're alone, but a lot of people do have miscarriages, and a lot of people then after that do have successful birth. And after the second miscarriage, Toni bought a dog. And she said to me, Jason, I'm picking up this dog. It's in Goulburn. Now, Goulburn is about 2.5 hours from Sydney. And she just drove there, got the dog, and came back round trip and took Archie and Mickey with her. And a couple of months later, we went to Bali, and Sophia is the result of that. Weren't on IVF. And Toni just said, that little furry Toby, she said, just the love that it gave her life and the way it made her feel just changed everything. And what tipped her over, like Toni's Lebanese background, so she's very spontaneous and in the moment. But she said she read a research paper that people that had been through serious life stress, they did a scientific study with 3 cohorts. One bought a dog, one had counselling, and one group did nothing. And the group that significantly dropped cortisol levels was the group with the dog. So she said that's all she needed to know when she was just feeling so upset and so sad. And so the Sophia, largely we say, is on this life because of love and the chemical balance that Toby brought. Now, not long after that, Millie arrived, and my mother said, got to get rid of the dog. 4's enough. So it became a family joke that Toby was just this propagator of other people. So I share that because I really feel your story, because we've had a similar experience with Toby after going through a really tough time.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. That's a beautiful story. And science aside, it doesn't surprise me. I just think the impact of that energy is nothing but positive. And that's a cool story.
For anyone listening to this, just get his book, read it. It's a beautiful story. Like me, if you think, where's he going to take me on this journey? It really is. It's a journey up and down and emotions and beautifully told. But what would you like to close out specific to the story about Ark?
Yeah, I think, and you saw the little post the other day on LinkedIn about the leadership part of it, and that didn't really land for me until after, a couple of months after the book came out, was this notion that someone had said, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a leadership book?" And I sort of thought, well, wait a second, I think I just did. And I only reason I got there was because of the feedback from other people saying, this is what it taught me. These are the lessons I took from it. And, similar to you, Andrew, our work is very much about the being of performance, right? And in terms of leadership, I just think if we could learn from our dogs, I mean, there's a lot about what dogs represent in terms of their presence, in terms of how they live life, that we as people can take big, profound lessons from. And so you move that into the role of leadership. If leadership is about relationships and about being and about presence and about love and compassion, then, I think the book, all of that is on display in the book in terms of how we need to be as leaders, right?
The entrepreneur inside me saying, Jason, just write one on leadership. Given the same stuff, champ. Like John Gordon. Yeah. Do you know John?
I don't.
So he's written multiple books, The Energy Bus, The Leader Within. He tells beautiful parables and stories.
Right, right.
Just write another one, mate. Just tell them it's about leadership. Just change it.
Right, okay.
I've really enjoyed this today. It's the love, it's the compassion, it's the reflection. You think a lot, you're deep. You've had some big life experiences. You probably glossed over your emotions at a young age, like many of us do. You don't gloss now. You sink into those emotions. You reflect. You feel. You have a massive leaning in towards social justice and fairness and equality. I can imagine that just keeps you literally, your head turning over some nights.
Yeah. Well, that's impressive as hell. We haven't. This is our conversation, right? This is our introduction. And if I were to, if one of your questions was, what bothers you more than anything else, I would say injustice. It is my powder keg, right? I can get very upset at injustice when I see the little guy sort of thing or what have you. It really sets me off. And you know what? For as long as I can remember, and I don't know if that comes from my dad. I'm not sure, but injustice is a biggie.
I didn't read that anywhere about you. I felt that.
Yeah.
From the moment we connected, I have felt that.
Wow. Yeah. Neat.
Thank you, Jason Dorland, for achieving high performance today. You've really turned up to this. We talk about performance intelligence, the ability to adapt your physical, your psychological, your emotional, would even add now your social state. You've taken me on a roller coaster today. I didn't know what to expect. I'd read your story, I've read the book, but you've taken me on a journey today, and I can see how you now do that in your coaching. I can just see how you'll do that in your workshops and your keynotes. So it's so authentic. So from me, heartfelt thank you for bringing high performance to this discussion today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Andrew. Yeah, when I got the invite, I was thrilled, right? And and especially because I spent time in Australia. I had so many friends down there in Melbourne and had such a wonderful time. When we used to travel into international regattas, the Canadians and the Australians, always got on so easily. So I feel like if you lived here or if I lived there, we'd be friends. And that's a cool thing.
We'd go for a hike with our dogs.
Yes, indeed.
Now, it's a truly global world now. Pre-COVID, especially 15 years ago, your work would have been mainly in Canada, a little bit in the States. Now we've got a digital global audience that can buy your books and products and book you online. For those people who are listening to this and going, hey, I want more of that guy, how do they best connect with you?
Yourmindset.ca is our website. So Your Mindset, just like it sounds, .ca as for Canada, and would be the best way. Email and everything's on there. Lots of social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter even, and Facebook. So all the usual spots. And then in terms of the book, Ike, love reading Ike. lovereadingike.com is where to go for that, lovereadingike.com. And people can either order it from me or, and no offense taken, if the listeners have Amazon and the shipping's free, then go for it, no problem. But I just want to get the story out. So however they come to it.
Well, a big thank you for helping get the story out today. I've loved our time. Cheers.
Thank you. Same. Agreed.